Welcome back to Sailing Northern Breeze. In episode 6, we'll explore southwest Iceland by land. We rented a little SUV for 2 days and saw many interesting sights, and we'll walk through those today. Some of the first interesting things were the boats around us in the harbor. This boat has spent winters in the Arctic on top of the ice. It has a fold-down transom used for loading their snowmobiles and the rib. It also has a folding keel, rudder, and prop. It allows them to get up on top of the ice floes for the winter. I suspect that the captain would need to be more introverted than extroverted to spend winters in that extreme isolation. And on the floating pontoon you can see the Northern Breeze. In front of us is the Wappen von Bremen, a club boat from Bremen, Germany. They had planned a trip to Greenland this summer as well, but unfortunately didn't find a weather window to make the short journey from here. It's only 3 days each way, but in order to do it they needed good winds and sea state, and also an ice-free approach to the eastern Greenland coast where they were headed, and they didn't get those 3 things ever to align during their time. They eventually had to return to Germany and chose the northern route around Iceland. We hope to see them again in 2023, either heading to Greenland, again for them, or perhaps if we stop in Bremen, where they have generously invited us to visit. And then across the dock beside us are our friends on the Misty Moor. We spent a few days together here before they headed around the south coast back to the Isle of Skye. They'd been away for nearly a year, leaving Scotland, down the coast of Europe to Africa, and then crossing the Atlantic to the Caribbean and back up the Atlantic coast of North America, before finally journeying with us across the Viking route. I can understand their hurry to get home. It'd been a long trip. So we headed into Reykjavik to enjoy being on land again. And now we can see a European city. It is much different than the Maritimes in Canada, very, very different than Greenland. A sense of relief overcomes us. The long Arctic passages are done for this year. We've many miles to go yet, but we won't be as isolated again in the cold with the icebergs. A huge weight lifted from our shoulders. The roses were in bloom here, literally and figuratively. This small park gives a nice view of the downtown area and contains a statue paying tribute to the first settlers to this area. According to the Book of Settlements, Ingolfur Arnarsson and his wife and brother settled here in 874 AD. The Vikings didn't have a written history tradition, so these details have been passed down orally through generations for 2 to 3 centuries before they were finally written into the Icelandic sagas, one of which is that Book of Settlements. Ingolfur is reported to have left Norway due to a blood feud, which was a common rationale for Vikings taking to the sea in search of new lands to settle. Further, we discovered the pedestrian mall, at the end of which is a huge Lutheran church. This street was somewhat touristy, but obviously much more and used by the locals. The city has many residents embedded in the downtown core, and therefore is a very lively downtown. And here's our little Suzuki ready for provisioning and sightseeing runs. It was a good little car, as the roads in Iceland have a lot of variety, and the 4-wheel drive feature proved necessary. On our first day, we saw many beautiful vistas, hot springs, waterfalls, farms, and Vestmannaeyjar Island and its puffin colony. We drove southeast, seeing mountains and lowlands with farms on very nice highways. One of our first sights was Skogafus Waterfall, a beautiful site with dozens of trekkers tent camping at the base area. The falls have a 200-foot drop into a quiet stream which meanders the final stretch of a mile or so to the sea. Next, we traveled on to the Black Beach at Reynistrangar. This sand is unique, fine silky basalt eroded from the volcanic shore surrounding this area. The southern coast is a ship's graveyard. There are over 100 miles of coast with virtually zero protection for ships, so most cruisers avoid this area. Bad weather here can result in tragedy. The rock formations on the left of this shot have interesting stories. Iceland has a strong tradition of Norse mythology. Here, these stones are either petrified trolls, who are frozen in place when hauling their boat ashore at dawn, but not fast enough to finish in time to avoid the petrifying sunlight. Or, they're also said to be the mast and sails of ships carrying a prince who refused the romantic advances of a witch. and were punished by being frozen in the rock here for all time. Mythology is very entertaining here. Trolls, witches, shapeshifters, all part of a Viking's life more than 1,000 years ago. And lupins. Iceland is full of lupins, growing wild across the country. They thrive in these soils and in this environment. And finally, we spent the afternoon on Vestmannaeyjar Island after a very short ferry ride. I expect that my pronunciation on these place names is very poor. Please excuse me. Sailing on the south side of this island would be risky, with many rocks, both exposed and submerged. A few of these small islands have tiny houses on the top of them, likely only accessible by very high ladders or helicopters. This island has a huge puffin colony. We really enjoy these entertaining birds. They're colorful and humorous, with their poor flying skills, often too heavy to catch flight after filling their belly with sand eels. They nest in holes and on outcroppings on cliffs for a few months per year and spend the rest of the year, including the winter, living on the oceans. We need a better camera next season, but for now, can you spot the puffins on this cliff? There are 5 locations with puffins. There is a little farming on the island, with aggressive geese and Rastafarian sheep, Marie's favorite. These vast flatlands along the coast of the mainland were the first settled areas for the Viking farmers. On our second day, we visited the Atlantic Rift, Althing, more waterfalls, and Viking excavation and hot springs. Here we are at the rift. Off to the left of this shot is the separating earth. This valley spreads out at about 2 centimeters per year. It has taken thousands of years to open up to this point and is partially filled with water. On the far side is the European tectonic plate, and we are on the near side, standing on the North American tectonic plate. This was the site of the earliest Icelandic government, which lasted a few hundred years. Each spring, chieftains and their representatives would gather here at Althing. A law speaker would recite the laws. Courts would be held and punishments determined. A typical punishment would be exile. Iceland had no king, no elected government for hundreds of years. It was governed by these farmer chieftains via the annual Althing gatherings. After their business was concluded, celebration was vigorous, as you might have guessed. This small figurine is reportedly Thor, holding a cross at the time that Christianity began to gain a foothold in the 11th century. Further down the highway, we visited the hot springs. The geology of the land has exposed fissures into the very hot core below, creating these water shows. Gullfoss, or Golden Falls, is a dramatic spot. Mythology here provides the name, as it is said that a Viking tossed his treasure into the pond at the bottom of the falls. Our last sight of the day was an off-road trip across a couple of miles of a volcanic field and trail to Stong Farm. This was one of the farms destroyed in the Hekla volcano eruption in 1104 AD. We lost our photos of the visit here, so we give credit to Regina for these. Several families lived in these turf longhouses with animals in attached wings. The sagas report that the Viking who lived here was killed by his foster brother over an affair. Human nature hasn't changed a lot over the last 1,000 years. Back in Reykjavik, we did a little urban sightseeing with roses, irises, and lupins catching Marie's eye, and the huge church with an amazing pipe organ and great views from the tower. You can see the opera house and the harbor in the top right of this shot. And finally, as we sailed away, we saw that a new boat had just arrived. This YouTuber, no bullshit, just sailing, also attempted a Greenland crossing in July. He didn't make it in 2022, his second solo attempt. Hopefully he'll try again in 2023. Later we enjoyed a few beverages and music in the local bar that was also a library, and planned our next expeditions. We'll sail around the north coast in our next video. So we like to end each video with thanks to all who enabled our adventure. So here's to the crew at St. Clair Marine, Kurt, Mark, Jose, Paul, and Kim, who helped us along the way, To Bruce at Specialty Fastener, who found every obscure thing that I asked him for. To the folks at binnacle.ca for our final hardware provisioning in Halifax. Jerry at St. Peter's for 2 summers of hospitality. Jerry and Cheryl and Shediac, as well as many others. Thanks to all, and we'll see you all in the Arctic Circle in episode 7.